For the last 20 years, TIC Performance has been helping you all shift better. And for the last 20 years, the hydraulic release bearing has remained relatively unchanged until today. Release bearing options has been OE or aftermarket. Both of them have been kind of lackluster. The OE release bearing system is typically a cast aluminum mixed with some plastic components, and we have seen plastic components fail. They can melt under extreme heat. The bases themselves, where they're cast, they're very thin and they can crack under extreme loading conditions. They're not very stable, and they're just made, generally they're made cheap. With the aftermarket units, you get a mixture of billet and some thought that goes into them by an engineer, but even those can be lackluster in many cases. And today I'm going to show you why, and I'm going to show you how we fix that. The way that it works is when you push your clutch pedal in, the master cylinder moves X amount of fluid. And it's always going to move that amount of fluid, which means that your release bearing is always going to move the same amount dictated by the master cylinder. So if you have an actual gap between the fingers of the pressure plate and the bearing, it has to make up that distance, and then it's only going to travel the amount that the master cylinder has told it to. So if it's away from the fingers by 100 thousandths, it's going to move that 100 thousandths plus whatever else it can do. So if you have 300 thousandths of total travel commanded by your master cylinder, then you're not going to get a full disengagement. Most clutches need more than 300 to disengage, so it's not going to disengage. That's why it's important for the bearing to always be touching the pressure plate fingers. Here's where the problem with the aftermarket release bearings come in. They do not have a way to maintain the interface between the pressure plate fingers and the bearing itself. So the bearing itself can eventually back its way away under extreme driving conditions. There are lots of examples and reasons as to why that bearing can kind of migrate away from the pressure plate fingers. And again, the master cylinder is only going to move so far. If it has to make up that air gap, you're not going to get a full disengagement. The air gap that people talk about is the distance between at rest with the system completely put together, transmission bolted in, and the base of the piston bottoming out against the base of the assembly. So that distance, and we're going to call it 100 to 150 thousandths with our system, that distance is to account for things like clutch wear and inconsistency in the clutch pressure plate itself. So as the clutch disc wears, it gets thinner. As it gets thinner, the pressure plate fingers move closer toward the transmission side. That's what that gap is needed for, is to maintain wear over time. It's not needed for anything else. On the OE system, we make that gap tighter because if you don't, the bearing is moving out further toward the end, which causes instability issues in the casting itself. Again, it's only going to travel the amount the master cylinder is telling it to move. So our system is made to ensure that that doesn't happen. There's never going to be an air gap between the pressure plate fingers and the bearing itself because you don't want that. We don't want that, so we made sure that you didn't have that. One of the problems with the aftermarket offerings that I personally don't like, if I'm putting an aftermarket release bearing into a car that originally came with a hydraulic release bearing like this, I want to be able to connect that right together. I don't want to have to order special fittings. I don't want to have to order special lines. I don't want to do any of that stuff. I want it to hook up. So we've developed a new patent pending system that we feel has solved all of the issues that I just mentioned. Our release bearing system will maintain the bearing interface against the pressure plate fingers, as I described. They have more stability than the factory units do. They're more robust. They have more stability than most of the aftermarket units do as well. And we've also designed them to bolt in as close to factory as possible. That way the install is easy, it's not overcomplicated, and it'll save you time. So this is our F-body release bearing. And as you can see, it has the factory connection on the end. It comes standard with an 8-inch speed bleeder. If you're not familiar with our speed bleeder, it's a check valve system where you can crack the bleeder and bleed the system by yourself. You don't have to have any extra help. You don't have to have one of those vacuum systems. It's just a little more simplified and easy to do. We also offer an extended bleeder for all of these release bearings, and that'll give you a 48-inch line. Another cool thing about our release bearing system is that you're going to see it mounts just like the OE does. It bolts straight to the front plate of the transmission using the factory bolts. We also supply bolts with these, so just in case you lose yours, you will get a new pair of bolts with it. The way that they're shimmed is the same as a factory release bearing. You're going to stack shims behind it. There's no threaded body. There's no washers where you actually have to pull this assembly apart, put washers on, put it back together. There's none of that overcomplicated, unnecessary. So as you can see, the fluid lines go into the base itself, and the piston will travel independently of the base, much like the OE assemblies are made. Some of the aftermarket offerings actually require the lines to be connected to the piston. The base is stationary, and the lines travel with the piston itself. I don't like that because it can cause problems if you don't put things in precise. Then you could end up with a line that could get into the clutch itself. Another cool thing about this system is it has a dual-stepped design. So rather than being one seal, it's double sealed, plus it has a dust wiper. And because it's double sealed and it has two different diameters, it has a lot more rigidity and stability to the base. In my right hand, we have an example of an OE release bearing base, and in my left hand, we have an example of one of our bases. I've left the seal inside of the OE one so you can see exactly how all this works and functions, but basically this inner tube is the portion that all of the stress of the pressure plate, any side loading on the bearing, all the force that's actually applied to that is going to go through this center tube. And you can see how thin and weak that looks down inside. And we have seen multiple examples of these cracking around the base in this area because of the stress they're put under. Now, as you can see in my left hand, we have one of our bases, and you can see how much more robust it looks. So when I mentioned that ours was a double-step design, that means that the piston rides on this diameter and this diameter. It also seals on both diameters. And what that means is that as the piston itself travels, it's always fully supported by the structure of the base itself. The piston moves and it never loses contact. It never decreases contact. So it's much more stable, much more robust, and it's much more reliable. If you've ever tried to pull two cups apart, you know that when they're pushed together all the way, that they're pretty firm, and as it comes apart, it starts getting a little more loose. Well, that's the same scenario with some of the OE offerings and some of the aftermarket offerings that don't offer this double support system. Another key feature on these release bearing assemblies is the way that the piston itself is locked and kept from rotating. So most of your aftermarket offerings are going to have a steel pin off to the side, and they're going to have an ear on the piston itself that catches that pin. And that works, but we decided to make it a little better in that regard too. With the aftermarket units that I've put in, a lot of them will actually require you to trim that pin to length after you've got your system together, but I didn't want our end users to have to do more work than they had to. So we designed our own system with a double pin setup that gives it just as much holding force to keep it from rotating as one single captured pin does. Something else to note on ours is we do install a lock ring on the end that keeps you from physically being able to blow this thing apart. It does not, however, keep you from being able to damage the master cylinder if ever you max travel this thing and then continue to push the clutch pedal. Let's say you have a 98 to 02 F body and you've installed a release bearing before. You know that to measure for a shim properly, the recommended procedure is to remove the bearing, remove the spring, install it back onto the base, make sure that it's fully seated, install it onto the trans, and then preferably use one of our measuring tools to measure, to be able to set your gap. With our system, there's no exposed spring for you to remove, and if you just push this thing down, it's just going to pop right back out. So it's going to make it hard to measure, right? You're going to have to hold this down, and you're going to have to hold the tool to be able to measure it, and who wants to do that? So what we've done is we've designed our system to have a lock clip that allows you to fully depress the release bearing all the way to the base. You can insert the lock clip, and now it's fully at rest. So now the bearing is all the way down as far as it's going to go. You can install this on the front of your transmission, measure and set that gap appropriately. When you're done and you're ready to put this on the car and put the transmission in, please remember to remove the lock clip, because if you don't, you're going to have problems. We have a C6 Corvette unit here. We have a C5 Corvette unit here, again, with factory connection. We have an actual TKX swap system that replaces the front bearing housing on the TKX. We'll get into that in a separate video, so be sure to check that out. We also have a completely aftermarket offering for a GT500. So 07 to 14 model GT500 Mustangs. There really isn't an aftermarket unit for those currently. They don't have They don't come factory with a bleeder line attached to the release bearing itself. So we decided to make a complete unit just for those cars that fix a lot of issues that those cars have and a lot of complaints that that community has with the release bearing system that's offered for those cars. On top of that, and not in front of me, is the 04 to 06 GTO release bearing. It's nearly identical to the F-body, except it has a different connection line. The bleeder lines for all of those come standard again with an 8-inch, and they all have an option for the extended bleeder. One we're going to have a separate video on as well. This one is very special to me. It is a game changer, to say the least. It's something that's never been on the market before. It's a 100% fresh idea from us to help out the drag racing community. So please be sure to check out that video because you're going to love what you see. So all of these release bearing systems, again, they're going to use as much of the OE style connection as they can. That way you have quick disconnect points that are the same or very similar to the way that the OE connects their lines. So for instance, with the GT500, as it exits the bell housing, it's going to have this single O-ring quick connect fitting. The opposite side that this attaches to is either the OE quick connect fitting that this snaps into, so you can use your factory line with the system, or we also offer a full length line that comes from the master down to this point, and we also offer the fitting that maintains this quick connect. That way you don't have to make your connection with the AN union and a couple of wrenches. I'm not necessarily a fan of that, so I like the quick connect, and that's the way we went with it as well. The C5, again, it has the factory line that exits the bell housing with the swept tube that is bent and the factory quick disconnect. My favorite from GM by far is this one. It's a dry brake system, so when you disconnect it, you don't lose a bunch of fluid. It doesn't go everywhere. Again, by far my favorite design from General Motors. And all of the cars that were equipped with this are going to get this. C6. So the C6 system, as you can see, it's a little different. Again, standard with the 8-inch bleeder like all of them have. The line is meant to route up to the original disconnect on the C6. And you can see that it's not quite right at the edge of the torque tube or the bell housing. It actually routes up into the engine bay. On top of the frame rail is where the disconnect is from the factory on those cars. We also offer a line with our adjustable master cylinder kits that will connect back to this specific location with a quick disconnect. If you want to find out more information about these new release bearings, you can go to tickperformance.com, or you can call and speak to one of our knowledgeable sales staff. And as always, Team Tick members save more.